I'd like to acknowledge mana whenua first. To you, mahi, tēnā koe. I want to acknowledge the Chamber, tēnā koutou, of course the Export New Zealand and Business New Zealand. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So today we're going to be talking about the trade negotiations that we have underway at the moment. But it wouldn't make a lot of sense for us to get into talking about all that stuff if we didn't talk about this first. We have around 11 existing free trade agreements. So this is in place at the moment, and many of you here, if you're involved in business, you're already making use of this. This is the network of trade agreements that we have currently. I want to talk to you about a couple of really handy tools before we get into talking about the trade negotiations. One of them is this thing here. This is our Tariff Finder. So I know that some of the people in this room, if you're in business, you're probably very focused on what your mahi is, your business. And depending on the product that you're interested in, the market that you're interested in, you can come here, type in, well, first go on Google, type in Tariff Finder. This is the thing that's going to pop up first. Then type in the product, whether it's peanut butter, tuna, and then type in the country, the market that you're interested in. Up will pop the tax, the tariff that you're facing into the market at the moment. This is a really handy tool, and I know a lot of you are already using it, so just wanting to make you aware of it. Another really handy tool for business is this thing here. This is our tradebarriers.gov.nz website, portal. So in the New Zealand government, we operate a no wrong doors policy when it comes to trade barriers. So one of the easiest ways that you can lodge your trade barrier with us is to come to this website, give us all the information. It will walk you through what we need to know, and then we can take a look at it. We will get back to you, acknowledge your email within 24 hours, and then within 6 weeks we will provide you with a plan as to how we're going to help you address your trade barrier. Importantly, we'll try and give you a straight answer. What I mean by that is there'll be people here who are facing barriers, and actually those barriers may be legitimate, just in the same way that New Zealand has some legitimate barriers. You know, we need to look after our food safety, our biosecurity. Other countries too have some legitimate barriers which they're allowed to maintain by law. There may be other barriers though where we know there are things that we can address. Some of those may be things like certificate problems, where our people who are working in posts overseas will give us some advice, and we'll go, yep, we've heard of that issue again before, and this is something that can be resolved fairly quickly. Other times it may be an issue that we've been tackling for years. So we will endeavour to give you a straight answer. One of the great things that this does is it ensures that you get your answer and that it gets to the right place, and we have staff who are tracking it. But depending on what the barrier is, as many of you will know who've dealt with regulatory issues, I have to be honest, sometimes it's MB dealing with it, sometimes it's MPI dealing with it, sometimes it could be another agency. But this is a nice little way of making sure that it gets to the right place and that we get back to you in time. So really encourage you to make use of this tool. That's a big long list. These are the trade negotiations which we have underway currently. I won't go into long detail on all of these. There is information available on our website, and you can get in touch with us anytime. But I'll just mention a few things about them, and then Ali's going to go into more depth about the EU-New Zealand FTA and some things that we're negotiating when it comes to the digital commerce, the digital trade world. China Fta Upgrade. Now the China FTA was done in 2008. It was the first time that China had done a trade deal with a developed country, and it was one of our most successful trade deals. Were you involved in that one?
I am behind the scenes.
Okay, we have a colleague here who's worked in MB and Customs and been negotiating this stuff with us from a long time back. Since that trade deal in 2008, New Zealand's exports to China have quadrupled. So that's good news. But, well, I should first say that this was a great agreement. There was some unfinished business. And they have done deals with other countries since 2008, and we've seen what they can do in other areas. So a couple of areas which we would regard as unfinished business would be in the areas of goods. It was very, very comprehensive, apart from some processed wood, paper tariffs. And we regard that as unfinished business. So we're negotiating with China now to see what we can do about getting those tariffs removed. Another area where we feel there's some unfinished business was in the services negotiations. We've seen now what China has done with some other countries, so we're trying to lift commitments there around services trade. And then perhaps the last thing I will mention is environmental standards. We did have commitments on that, but that is something that we're looking to improve. Another trade deal that we did in 2008, one involving 12 countries, was the Fta. That is singularly the worst acronym that I know of, but it stands for the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. Another very successful trade agreement. And this covers the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand. It was the first time that Australia and New Zealand had negotiated together as a block in a negotiation. Another very successful agreement. We are now going through the process. This part has only just kicked off, where we're looking to upgrade that agreement also. As part of the process for that, which got underway around, the scoping process started in about early 2017. This will not cover improvements on goods commitments or on intellectual property, but it will cover just about everything else to do with the agreement. Another very topical negotiation that's underway at the moment, the acronym is only slightly worse than ANZFTA, it's RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, involving 16 countries. So essentially it's the same countries that are in ANZFTA, the 10 ASEAN countries, Australia and New Zealand. Then you have the North Asian countries of China, Japan, Korea. And there will be astute people in the audience who are saying, hold on, don't you already have trade agreements with all those countries? We do. One country that's in RCEP that we don't have an agreement with is India. And they tend to have high tariff barriers. So we also have a bilateral process where we're negotiating with India, but to be frank, we haven't met formally at negotiator level since November 2015. So right now the focus between between India and New Zealand is to try and move that trade relationship forward as part of the RCEP process. And our negotiators are working very hard to reach substantive conclusion on RCEP this year. Over half the world's population are represented as part of RCEP, and it's 56% of New Zealand's goods trade. So that's pretty significant. Another one to mention is Pacific Alliance. This is another negotiation that we have underway at the moment, and this involves some Latin American countries, 4 countries, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia. Of those, Colombia is the one that we don't have a trade agreement with. This is the world's 6th largest trading bloc. Again, similarly with some of the other agreements that we've been doing, such as CPTPP, which many of you will know came into force in December last year, and we're really seeing the fruits of that now. With Pacific Alliance, we see real potential for the future. This group of countries and this negotiation could expand to a larger grouping, and one of the things that we've learnt through our experience as trade negotiators is that if you want to get into a trade grouping like this, it's better to come in from the start rather than come in later, where basically the members that are already in there try to strike a bit of a hard deal. So we're in there early with the Pacific Alliance partners and trying to get a deal on that by the end of this year. Those are the main things I am intending to talk about. The other things that are mentioned here, EU New Zealand FTA, well, Ali's the deputy lead on that, and she's also very involved in these two other negotiations that are mentioned here, WTO e-commerce, and another one which we're calling DEPA, Digital Economic Partnership Agreement with Singapore and Chile. So I'm going to leave that for Ali to mention. Before that, I'm going to touch on this thing. I wouldn't really call it a trade negotiation per se. Guess you could. Actually, is anyone here from the UK High Commission? I hope you saw the news. We had Secretary of State Truss in town on Monday, met with my minister, actually met with a couple of ministers, and she's very, very keen that after the divorce, the formal divorce between the UK and the EU, she sees Australia, New Zealand and the United States separately being amongst, I guess you would say, the first cabs off the rank. And that has been the result of, well, many generations of relationships between UK and New Zealand, but also because of many years of hard work, not just by people in government, but many of the people here in this room in terms of our people-to-people links with the UK. So I've jumped ahead to the last bit first, but we are hoping that after Brexit happens, that New Zealand and UK can move swiftly to conclude a trade agreement. In the meantime, we've been working hard to look after New Zealand's interests. One of the ways we've been doing that is by ensuring regulatory continuity. Our colleague Michelle Slade, who leads on this stuff, was a bit ahead of the game when it comes to regulatory continuity. By January this year, we had concluded a veterinary arrangement which covered livestock products and animal products. And also when it comes to regulatory continuity, she had concluded a mutual recognition agreement which covers 7 types of manufactured goods. So all that work was finished earlier this year in terms of making sure that the standards that we face now, those of you who are in business, will have clarity about the situation on that after the 31st of October or whenever Brexit happens. Another thing that we've been working hard on is making sure that the access that New Zealand exporters enjoy now into the UK and the EU is not compromised on as part of the divorce arrangement. So you may have again seen some comments from my minister on Monday about his meeting with Secretary of State Truss, and we're working hard to ensure that the tariff rate quota arrangements that affect in particular a number of New Zealand's agricultural products at the moment, that we are not worse off when it comes to those after Brexit, because the UK and EU have made some proposals about splitting the quotas there, which we have some concerns about. So we've been working hard on that on your behalf. Now finally, before I hand the mic to Ali, I just want to say on Brexit, if you think that this is something that could affect you, I would really encourage you to check out all the information that we have publicly available on this. Again, it's sort of a no wrong door, but there are 4 main places. One is our website, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, MFAT. Another is with NZTE, Customs, and with Ministry of Primary Industries. So if you go to any of those 4 websites, you can see the material that's been prepared there, and it will also link you to the other websites. But really important that New Zealanders and New Zealand businesses are aware of how they could be affected by Brexit. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand it over to Ali, who's going to talk to you about the EU-New Zealand FTA.
Kia ora everyone, ko Ali Hamilton aho. Thanks very much for coming, and as John mentioned, I'm going to speak about the EU FTA, and I'm also going to tack on at the end a couple of comments about 2 additional processes that we have underway with respect to digital trade. So on the EU, where's my clicker? Thank you. So on the EU, I'm going to give a sort of a brief update in terms of the work that we've done so far between New Zealand and the EU on our free trade agreement negotiations. And I'm going to move through some of the topics that we're negotiating and give a bit of an update around sort of the status of some of those topics. And I'm going to talk about what happens next in terms of our negotiations with the EU. Then I'm going to talk about the WTO and the deeper processes that John mentioned before. So first things first, in terms of the EU-New Zealand FTA, we launched negotiations, I think, almost exactly a year ago, mid-2018. And since then, we've had 5 negotiating rounds. A negotiating round is when my colleagues and I go to Brussels, or our colleagues from the EU come down to Wellington, and we get together and talk about all of the different subject areas in the free trade agreement. That involves a range of colleagues around NZ Inc. So we have our customs colleagues, we have MB colleagues, we have primary industry colleagues, and a big NZ Inc. negotiating team to talk about all of the different subject matters. We are moving quite quickly with the EU FTA. We've been in trade negotiator land, these things can take a really, really long time. And the EU has a history of taking a long time to negotiate these deals. But we're really confident that we can move swiftly, and that with a partner like the EU and New Zealand, where we have a really shared, a common objective to do a high quality deal, that we can move quickly. So we've had 5 rounds so far. That's a lot for us in a year. And we've moved quickly to get to agreeing to text and to exchange initial offers in some of the core market access areas, including around our goods tariffs, but also around services and investment, and also government procurement. So we're really happy with the progress. We've had a number of really useful exchanges, and we're now starting to think about what next in terms of some of the more challenging issues in the negotiation. We're starting to encounter some of the areas of more sort of crunchy negotiations, and I'll get to those as well. So to start with the opportunity, I think it almost goes without saying in terms of the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, this is a really significant commercial opportunity for New Zealand. At the moment, New Zealand is one of a few developed WTO members that does not have a free trade agreement with the EU. And the impact of that is really practical. It means that New Zealand and the EU are discriminating against each other compared to our respective free trade partners. It means that a New Zealand exporter will face a competitive disadvantage compared to an exporter from a country that does have a free trade agreement. And that, we think, needs to be rectified. We want to level the playing field and bring that into balance. We're also talking about a really significant partner. We're talking about, really high numbers. We're talking $22 billion worth of two-way trade. I think I always get the numbers mixed up, but when you take the UK out, we're still talking $16 billion worth of two-way trade.
That's right.
That's right. So it's a really significant commercial opportunity, and if we can rectify, level the playing field, and ensure that we're starting from a common basis, it's a really significant opportunity. Part of the opportunity with an EU-New Zealand free trade agreement is about the common objectives and the shared ambition that EU and New Zealand share. And this is a really important part of what we're negotiating in the free trade agreement. So between New Zealand and the EU, we have a shared outlook in terms of wanting to ensure that trade can benefit all citizens. In New Zealand, we call that the Trade for All agenda. we might have borrowed the term from the EU. They also have a Trade for All agenda. And it's about making sure that trade can benefit small and medium-sized enterprises. It's about making sure that trade can benefit Indigenous peoples and women and everyone in society, people in the regions, and that we're not doing trade deals for the benefit of one or two big corporates who happen to exist in Wellington or Auckland. The EU shares that objective, so it's a common platform, a shared ambition to start from, and we're working really hard to make sure that the free trade agreement negotiations between us reflect those common objectives and common ambitions. A core component of that is something that we call trade and sustainable development, or sustainability. In the past, in our free trade agreement negotiations, we've included chapters covering things like trade in the environment or trade in labour. In the EU FTA, we are looking to bring those into one big chapter called Trade and Sustainable Development. And that's a really significant part of the FTA to demonstrate that, you know, the trade world that we're operating in does need to reflect sustainable development. It needs to reflect, you know, high environmental standards, labour standards, and the rest. Other points up there on the board, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. We look to include in our free trade agreements across the board, but specifically with the EU as well, a specific chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises. This is about recognising that New Zealand's economy is supported by SMEs. We're made up by SMEs, and SMEs need to be able to access the benefits of the trade agreement, and the trade agreement needs to be digestible and understandable and usable by SMEs. So we look to include a specific chapter on SMEs to help that to happen. And we think that's a really significant component of what we're negotiating with the EU. Two additional points around gender and Indigenous peoples. Trade and gender is a really significant topic, and it's something that we're working hard with the EU to make sure we can include provisions around trade and gender. Trade and gender, I like to describe it as mana wahine. It's the idea of making sure that, you know, we capture the women's economic empowerment and that trade and gender features as a component of the free trade agreement. Indigenous peoples as well, we look to include provisions in our free trade agreements to ensure that we are supporting the Māori economy, a really significant component of New Zealand's economy, and we need to make sure that the free trade agreement is accessible and reflects those commercial interests as well. So I'll move on to some of the other things that we're negotiating, some of the things where we may have more differences between New Zealand and the EU, and then talk through some of the details there. The first is around agricultural market access. I talked about some of the areas where New Zealand and the EU have a shared ambition, a shared outlook. Agricultural market access is perhaps one of the more difficult issues where we don't have the same sort of history or shared approach to agricultural market access. We've been very clear with the EU that this is a core component of the free trade agreement for New Zealand, and it's something that we're working really hard to make sure that we can rectify and level the playing field with respect to agriculture market access. Something that our primary exporters have faced difficulties accessing the EU over a long history. So the free trade agreement is a chance for us to right that balance. The second point that we're negotiating is around services. Services is one of the areas where we can really demonstrate high ambition between New Zealand and the EU. We share a goal of having very high quality services commitments. Services are things like an engineer or a consulting company or international education services, areas that are really important for New Zealand, and we're working really well to build high quality commitments on services with the EU. Another area that we're negotiating is intellectual property. Intellectual property is one of the issues that was raised in the context of TPP and CPTPP negotiations, generated a lot of debate and discussion within New Zealand around what our international commitments are with respect to intellectual property. And in the context of the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, The EU is asking some of the same things of us that were asked of us in the TPP and CPTPP context. That's a challenge for New Zealand, and it's something that we have to consider extremely carefully. At this stage, we have proposals from the EU. We don't yet know how far those proposals will be pushed. We don't know how far the EU will push us on some of those issues, but we do know that they're on the table. Some of these things around, for example, term extensions for protections are on the table, and we're being discussed in the free trade agreement negotiations. A part of intellectual property, but slightly different, is the idea of geographical indications. Geographical indications is one of the most important issues in the trade agreement for the EU. And a geographical indication, or we call it a GI, I'll use the acronym, is a name or a term associated with the geography of where something is from, denoting a reputation or a quality of that particular product. And the EU has a really strong history of GI protection and is asking New Zealand to also adopt GI protection in our context. What that means in practice is that if you are a producer or if you generate a product that uses terms that the EU seeks to protect as GIs, you're not allowed to use those terms in New Zealand. A classic example is Fta. So the EU is asking New Zealand to protect the term Fta, and it means that New Zealand producers could not use that term because they have not produced their product in the particular region of the EU that you have to produce it in to qualify for the GI. Hope you follow. The EU has put down a really long list of terms, so we're close to 2,200 terms that it seeks to protect in our market. We already do some protection of GIs. We already have a wines and spirits regime, but what the EU is asking is to extend that into foodstuffs and to extend that into additional terms. So this is really important for the EU, and it's something that we have to take seriously as a result of that. That is significance for the EU. And we have started our consultation process on that. That was conducted, the initial consultation was conducted back in March. And we know that there are particular concerns being raised by some aspects of New Zealand industry. And we know that there are also opportunities that some New Zealand industry sees in terms of seeking protection of additional GI terms. So there's a balance in there. I think the most important thing around GIs or geographical indications is that we've been really upfront with the EU that we'll talk about GIs and we can have a conversation, but that has to be in the context of an overall market access deal that works for New Zealand's interests as well. So the GIs component is a really strong EU interest, and the market access, quality of market access is a really strong New Zealand interest, and those have to work in unison. They have to go side by side. And that's a very clear connection, and it's something that's been, quite upfront and on the table since the beginning of negotiations. And we think that's a really significant part of the negotiation that we're having, that we will talk about GIs that are of interest to the EU, and we also have to be talking about the things that are of interest to New Zealand. So there's a clear link there. A further point of negotiation is around government procurement. Government procurement is the commitments around access to government contracts. That a New Zealand firm or supplier could bid for a contract in EU, a government contract in the EU, and vice versa, that someone in the EU could come to New Zealand and bid for New Zealand government contracts. We already have commitments on government procurement with the EU in the context of the World Trade Organization. It's called the Government Procurement Agreement, or the GPA. And the question in the free trade agreement negotiations is, to what extent should we top that up? Should we build on our existing commitments? The EU is asking for commitments that move down the level of government. So our commitments could apply at the central level, or they could apply at the local level of government. For the EU, the local level is important, And for us, our commitments to date have predominantly focused in the central level. So there's a question about the commercial benefit to be gained from making additional commitments on government procurement. Some other issues, hopefully some good news, some of the things perhaps that we're not negotiating with the EU. And the first is around investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS. This was another issue that generated a lot of debate and controversy in the context of the TPP and CPTPP negotiations. And the government is very clear that it opposes the inclusion of ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, in our free trade agreement negotiations. We're in a happy situation with the EU in that we are not negotiating investor-state dispute settlement, so it will not be included in the free trade agreement. It's simply not on the table. That's a really great outcome for negotiators, but it's also a good outcome in terms of demonstrating the ability to include investment commitments without including the ISDS component at the same time. The right to regulate, something that has come through in a number of our conversations with New Zealanders, and including in the context of our Trade for All consultation and in the context of TPP, CPTPP, is the need to ensure that the free trade agreements that we negotiate preserve and protect the government's right to regulate, particularly in areas that are, that New Zealanders hold dear, the ability to regulate for the environment, for health, for safety reasons, those kinds of things. And that's something that the EU also really shares. New Zealand and the EU have a common objective to ensure that we're protecting the right to regulate. And you see these protections built in throughout an FTA. You might see it in the form of exceptions or general exceptions. You might see it in the form of particular carve-outs or exclusions from particular chapters. But you also, I think in the EU context, will see more upfront statements from negotiators and from treaty drafters that we are protecting the right to regulate. We've got a chance with the EU as a like-minded partner in this context to really demonstrate that we are taking that right to regulate really seriously. And final point on the slide is around the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi exception is a really important part of the free trade agreements that we negotiate, not just with the EU, but all of the free trade agreements that John included on his list as well. And the Treaty of Waitangi exception is something that we will include in the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. And helpfully for this particular negotiation, it's included in the EU's negotiating mandate. So that's a really solid platform for us. It means that we know that the exception will be included, and it means that we don't have to have a really significant debate about it. It's built into the mandate. And that provides a really comfortable starting point for New Zealand in terms of something that's really, really important for us. So that's what I'm going to say about the EU Free Trade Agreement. We'll move into Q&A, and I'm happy to go into more detail or to talk about specific components, because what I've done is kind of run through the entire negotiation and give a little bit of flavour about some of the things that we are negotiating, and I'm more than happy to get into more detail if that's useful. So please ask questions. I'm now going to quickly, if I have time, talk about the two processes I mentioned around digital trade. The first in the World Trade Organization, and second the DEPA. So digital trade, it's a bit of an odd term, because essentially the digital economy is the economy. Everything is changing to be conducted in a digital fashion over the internet, and it's hard to consider trade without a digital component to it. And the international trade rules haven't necessarily kept pace with the commercial world. We've got a bit of a lag between the commercial evolution that's going on and the international rules that exist in either the World Trade Organization or our free trade agreements. So we have two opportunities that are currently being negotiated to try and bring into the modern era some of these agreements that we have. So the World Trade Organization, We have a process that is being discussed among 80 members of the WTO. That's not everyone. It's 80 of about 164 members. So it's a really significant number. And we have got big players in the room. China is there, the EU is there, the US is there, Russia is there. So we've got really significant, New Zealand is there, obviously, big player. We've got a really big number of WTO members who are taking really seriously the idea that we can modernise and bring a bit of a digital trade flavour to WTO rules. And some of the things that are being talked around personal privacy protection, around flows of information, and around the need to ensure that trade can be facilitated in a digital context, we are talking about in the WTO. The final thing I'll mention is around DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is a trilateral conversation between New Zealand, Chile and Singapore. New Zealand, Chile and Singapore have a history of working together. We have negotiated a number of times with these partners, and with the DEPA we are thinking about what might be possible in terms of a model or a high standard digital economy agreement. The idea is that we can shape and develop rules with our like-minded partners that can then influence the other processes, particularly in the World Trade Organization, but also in APEC or the OECD or other places that are talking about digital trade. The idea with DEPA is that we will have a living agreement, and a living agreement means that it can grow both in membership but also in substance. So as the digital economy grows, as barriers to trade change, as the nature of trade changes, so too can our trade rules, and that we can really try to keep pace with the commercial world, try to avoid the lag that we have got at the moment. It's a lofty goal, but we're doing our best. The idea with DEPA is that we can do something faster and higher ambition than we might be able to achieve in the World Trade Organization. So that's where I'll end. I really acknowledge that I've sort of skated through some of the detail, and there may be questions, so John and I are really, really open to that.
Fantastic. Thank you to both John and Ali for those very comprehensive presentations. John, your summary of what's going on in the space, and also some really useful tools that I think everyone can benefit from, particularly when you get stuck with a barrier and you really don't know what to do. There now are a lot of avenues to actually get some help, and Ali, that's a very comprehensive view of the EU agreement. So are there any initial questions? Because if not, I would like to start. Oh, all right. I'm just going to start with one question. F&B in New Zealand is huge. 2,200 of those geographical indicators. Yeah. And what do I do if I can't go to the supermarket and find Fta? Just initial comments on how you even begin to deal with that.
Yeah. That's a good question, and the practical implications of a GI regime, we've experienced it a little bit in the context of wines and spirits, but the extension into foodstuffs is a new world. So I think the most practical piece is to make sure that we are talking to industry that are potentially affected by these changes, and making sure that we are we fully comprehend the change that would be required. Some of the changes that might be needed if, and this is a big if certain terms are protected, would be around labelling, would be around marketing, would be around the way that you present your product. So you might be able to call Feta salty salad cheese or something like that. But is the New Zealand consumer going to understand and respect that label? That's a big question. And we're really reliant on the input that we get from industry and that we get from the
New Zealand public as well.
From the New Zealand public around the impact of that. And the ways that people can have input into that is sort of a couple. The first was the initial consultation that we had around the list. That was, I mentioned back in, I think it was March, where we put out the list of names and said, what do you think? Tell us what sort of impact this would have. That led to a really good level of engagement, and there's been ongoing conversations with industry around particular terms or particular impacts. But that's not the end of the road. The second question is, once you have these words, and if we decide to protect these words, what are the rules that go around that? What is the level of protection that's required? Can you say feta type or feta style? Can you say champagne style wine? Something, those are the kinds of questions. I can see my colleague from the EU delegation shaking his head. Perhaps you can't. But these are the questions around the level of protection that needs to be incorporated into the rules. And the EU has got a particular framework that it upholds. And the next part of our conversation with New Zealanders and with New Zealand industry is about our understanding and our approach to any framework that gets included. So watch this space. It's an ongoing conversation.
Oh, sorry, just to say another way that you can tell us your concerns about this. We operate a no wrong door policy, so you can just come up to us and tell us. But also the other way is through Jess. Jess, can you raise your hand? So when we do these talks all around New Zealand, we always take a note. And the note that Jess is taking, we will make sure that is reported back to all our negotiators, not just Ellie, but also to our ministers, so we can collate all these views. So anything you say to us tonight, unless you specifically don't want it to be taken as feedback, that will be passed back to our negotiators and to our ministers. So when it comes to making decisions around this important FTA and other trade negotiators, they're knowing, they have an idea of what New Zealanders are thinking. Sorry, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, no, thank you. All right, questions from the floor.
Can let them have
Hi, this is a question to Ellie. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the areas of negotiation on intellectual property law.
Sure. I don't know. Can you hear me if I just speak? Yeah. Okay. So the IP negotiation is a comprehensive negotiation of an IP chapter like what is included in our existing free trade agreements. But some of the specific areas that you might be interested in are around some of the terms of protection. So the EU has put proposals down around copyright term, put proposals down around patent term, and also around the protections for biologics or new types of medicines. So those areas that were part of negotiations in the TPP context are also part of negotiations in the EU FTA context. There's also part of the free trade agreement negotiations on IP that reflect some of our existing TRIPS or the WTO intellectual property component. So some of the more traditional elements of international intellectual property are also there. If you want to have a more detailed conversation about any of those specifics, let me know, and I can put you in touch with our IP leads as well. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just the gentleman behind you. I'll come back to you.
Thank you. Regarding the EU tariff rate quotas, I'm just wondering, the existing ones of course,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how they might be shared between the UK and the EU, assuming there is Brexit and assuming that we do have two free trade areas with both.
That's a really good question. At the moment, the question about quota and what happens in the event of a Brexit, if a Brexit happens and in what form, is still to be confirmed. We don't know what will happen there. What we do know, though, is that the EU and the UK have proposed a split of the quota. That means that New Zealand exporters who currently have the flexibility about where to send product based on particular market conditions or based on the time of the year would lose that flexibility. That's a really significant issue for New Zealand, and it's something that we are making representations in both Geneva, which is where the WTO is located, but also in London and around the EU to make sure that New Zealand's concern with that split proposal is well registered. It's something that John mentioned in terms of preserving access. That component of a Brexit discussion is really important to us, but we don't yet know how that's going to be resolved. In the context of an eventual UK FTA negotiation, or in the context of our ongoing EU negotiations, obviously our ultimate goal is to remove all tariffs and to not have quotas that we face. We're looking for free access. But we're pragmatic. There are particular approaches that take place up in Europe. So we're looking for the best possible access that we can get, but it has to be commercially meaningful. It really has to deliver commercial gains for us, and it has to be comprehensive. So we can't, pick and choose. It has to be comprehensive and commercially meaningful access. What that looks like in practice with a Brexit, you tell me.
So I don't know if it's the EU agreement or if it's the e-commerce agreement, but what is the provision, or is there any provision for purchasing through the internet, either from New Zealand or from the EU, and what are the provisions?
That's a really good question. So in the context of the EU Free Trade Agreement, we will have a chapter on digital trade. That the digital trade chapter looks to set up conditions that enable trade to happen in a digital way. So it doesn't say you can trade online, but it has sort of regulatory rules around the way that digital commerce or e-commerce is regulated to ensure that digital trade can take place. But also there are provisions in the goods chapters, so thinking about some of our pure goods trade that actually are enabled through free trade agreements, even if they're not purely digital type chapters. Things around paperless trading, for example, is not necessarily done in the digital chapter or the goods chapter, but would help to enable that. Then in the digital agreement, or the DIPA or WTO, the whole purpose of those agreements is to make sure that we are enabling and facilitating trade to take place online. There's a question about whether it's business to business, business to consumer, and the sort of level of trade, and where the trade rules can intersect with different types of transaction. But if you have ideas around things that would be useful to include, we're all ears. Anything else?
The UK has been in the EU for 45 years, and the EU and its previous guise, the common market, was created in the late 1950s. Why has New Zealand waited all this time to sign a free trade agreement with them?
We haven't been. We've been trying so hard. So we have.
Since the 1950s.
We have been, I think Peter will be able to tell me exactly, but we have been trying to launch negotiations with the EU for about 9 years. It's been a really significant priority for the New Zealand government and our trade policy for a long time. So we're really cognizant that this is a long time coming and that we have to get it right. Now that we're at the table, we've got such a huge opportunity to deliver a really commercially meaningful deal. So we can't squander that opportunity. But you're right, we've been sitting out there facing disadvantage into EU markets for a really long time.
So what was the catalyst for this to do it now?
That's a good question. I think the catalyst on the EU side I can't exactly speak to, but from the New Zealand side, we really saw an opportunity in terms of the shared values and the shared approach to trade that New Zealand and the EU it's not recent, but we're beginning to get closer in terms of some of those areas. So we saw an opportunity and we went for it.
Thank you.
Barry Helberg is my name. I think John knows who I am and what I do. My question to you is in terms of consumer attitudes to some of the aspects, such as should feta cheese continue to be called feta cheese or otherwise? In all the work I've done over the years with domestic groups in New Zealand, market research commissioned through professional market research companies is so important to determine consumer attitudes on particular subjects. Has the Ministry considered, apart from its formal submission process, commissioning any professional market research over what Kiwis think of things like should Fta continue to be kid off Fta or otherwise? If not, I commend the principle to you. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a really interesting proposition. It's not, consumer research is not something that, at least to my knowledge, that we have actively done.
I think we should be.
But we do know that our industry players in the space do have strong consumer links, and we hope that the submissions that we receive into the process reflect that. We also take really seriously the conversations that we have around New Zealand, around this issue, and I think hopefully we're getting direct to consumers, so we're talking directly about the issues. But you're right, it's a significant issue.
Hey Ali, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to government procurement with recent movements within the MD wanting to particularly focus on the New Zealand market, and the difference between an SME in New Zealand and an SME in Europe is drastic. So have there been any talks about how we balance New Zealand, particularly local suppliers who are perhaps more community based, most predominantly in the sort of NGO, not private sector, versus SME, which could be an amazing digital enterprise in Europe.
Huge.
Same happens here, but that difference there is quite important to highlight, particularly in terms of access and opportunities for business.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The question around government procurement and the way that we regulate our own government procurement market, and the answer I'll provide is common to a number of different areas where we have got domestic policy conversation ongoing. So one of our core objectives in trade negotiations is to make sure that what we negotiate at an international level does not get in the way of the conversations that need to take place at a domestic level. Part of that's the right to regulate, but it's also around the way that we construct obligations and the way that we construct chapters to operate at an international level as opposed to preventing the domestic conversation. So an example is potentially on government procurement. Another example is with respect to intellectual property and the work that's ongoing with respect to Y262 and issues around taonga species or other forms of traditional knowledge. So we work hard to make sure that our free trade agreements don't get in the way of the domestic conversations that need to take place for domestic policy reasons. Your point around SMEs is a really interesting one because countries have different approaches and different understandings of what SME means. And under some definitions, I think almost every New Zealand company would be an SME. And maybe that's the case anyway. But I think that's a really interesting point. I'm going to reflect on that.
I've got a question. So, the indicators thing bothers me because you also have protection for Indigenous. But if you look at the kia ora stoush between Air New Zealand recently and the fact that Moana and the Moa hunters cannot perform in Germany, have we ever thought about putting any provisions in any of these where we protect some of our own Indigenous language terms if they're going to protect their geographical indicators?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, but let me give some more detail and perhaps Hone will as well. There is an opportunity for us here to think about what we might look to protect from a geographical indications perspective. I mentioned the balance between the costs that some industry would face and then potentially an opportunity for other parts of New Zealand business. That I think comes through in the Indigenous business space. A classic example to bring up is Manuka honey. There is potential with respect to Manuka around the way that term is protected offshore. There's a real chance to do something there. Some of the questions around the specific EU proposals around the framework and the sort of requirements to qualify for protection could be problematic. The way that the EU's proposal is framed requires a certified trademark, essentially, in order to get GI protection. So that might be a barrier, but that doesn't stop us from having the conversation or to think creatively about what we might do. I think there's also an opportunity to think bigger around, what sort of protections could we design for Mātauranga Māori more broadly. That's a big question, but I think it's something that we're definitely cognizant of and working on.
I think your point about traditional knowledge is a really important one, and it's something that we often get asked when we're travelling around the country, and particularly if we're engaging with Māori audiences. People really care deeply about Mātauranga Māori and want to know how it's being protected. There is a large piece of work underway, actually several pieces of work, to protect those things here in Aotearoa. So one thing that we just need to be aware of is that there is a lot of mahi, a lot of work that we need to do here at home first in terms of protecting genetic resources and traditional knowledge. I know that, for example, you have the Kamate Attribution Act, for example, which is one area where some work has been done in that, but we also need to be upfront and acknowledge that we do need to get our house in order, and I have been quite I have seen the work that's happening now with governments, with government colleagues in response to that very famous Waitangi Tribunal claim called Y262, where Minister Mahuta has been leading a process where she's established some structures of ministerial committees to oversee that work and make sure that it's pushed ahead. Our colleagues at Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, who look after the IP stuff, are very well advanced into a consultation around plant variety rights. They've also advanced on a consultation around disclosure, mandatory disclosure of origin, which is one of the things that was also recommended as part of the Y262 report. But it's worth keeping in mind for those of you who see stuff pop up on the news, it's quite difficult for us as negotiators to go to other countries and say, hey, we want this protected. And they go, oh, cool, how do you protect it in your country? Oh, well, and also within Te Ao Māori, right? This is something that we often need to remember too. There are different views. There's people who want to commercialise and be able to leverage off Mātauranga Māori, and there's others who are saying, taiho, we need to slow down. So there's a dialogue and a bit of a conversation and a debate here in New Zealand. Also need to remember that we have a unique, not entirely unique, but I'm going to say unique situation in Aotearoa in terms of, this is probably a bad word, our colonisation profile, where we've come from. And when we're talking to other countries about what's important to us here in Aotearoa, that works to some extent with some countries, but some of the countries that we're dealing with just say, oh, not so interested in include. We've never done anything like this, and we're not interested in doing it. So we try hard, we do our best. I want to say that in particular, I'm proud of what we did with the CPTPP. There is there's language in there on traditional knowledge and setting up a way in which that we can cooperate with our CPTPP partners on that, and that was a world first. Slightly different kaupapa, but also, of course, the ANZTEC agreement, the one that we have with Chinese Taipei, has government-to-government corridor that goes on around Indigenous-to-Indigenous cooperation, and that's also something that was a world first, and that as a government, I think we're very proud of.
I've talked to Charles Finney about that, so that was a very well negotiated and a very interesting opportunity, because I think you're right, as Māori we need to go out and use those trade agreements and help you understand how that works when we go and engage with other Indigenous groups.
That's
and
right.
I also acknowledge what you say, Māori is not a homogenous group either, and sometimes we need to have sorted out our stuff, which is about going and taking Y262 to the tribunal to establish that and then decide how we can better protect those to inform you for negotiation. Thank you. Other questions from the floor?
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned that the EU has proposed a list of about 2,200 GIs. I've looked through those lists, and to be honest, there are many on there that I do not recognise or that I would consider to be commonly known amongst New Zealanders. In which case, is there any statistics on how many or what proportion of those names would one consider as not being at issue in New Zealand? Considering that, for example, there's a lot in there that are protected under their GI names like Parmigiano Reggiano rather than Parmesan, or Prosciutto di San Daniele rather than Prosciutto. Is there a huge proportion that's going to cause an issue, or just a handful?
That's a good question. So the list is big, right? 20. I think it's, I forget the exact number. Close to 2,200. That's a scary number, and it's not insignificant. But you're right. There are a number of products on that list that probably will never be exported to New Zealand, and that's okay. The EU still is asking us to protect those, and we still have to think about that really carefully. It might be that the market does grow, and all of a sudden we're getting niche products down in New Zealand that we haven't had before. So I think we have to be quite clear-eyed about examining the list from that perspective. I don't have the exact stats to mind, but I think you're right that there are a number of names or terms on the list that we haven't seen before, but that's not to say they're not really important to the EU, and they're seeking protection for a reason. In terms of the final point you made around, are there a handful that could be a problem? I think that's right. At the end of the day, it will probably come down to negotiations on a few products. What that looks like in negotiations, it's probably too soon to tell, but I think the negotiations will come down to specific products.
Other question? Ellen, what's the time? Do you have it? I mean, this is a terrible thing to ask in a free trade agreement, but what's your timing for this? Or, I mean, you've had 5 meetings this year. That's a lot.
It is, yeah. That's a good question. So we're wanting to move quite quickly with the EU. The point around, we've been waiting a long time for this rings really true. We need to do this quickly to be able to capitalise the commercial benefit. We had hoped that we would be able to conclude something this year. That's looking unlikely. It's looking increasingly difficult to get to that point. But we do think we can do something quite quickly. I don't want to put a deadline on myself or my colleagues for that matter, but we're definitely looking to move quickly. The EU has taken decades to negotiate other deals. We don't want to be in that situation, and we think we can do this fast for trade negotiators.
So on that then, when will it be evident what the provisions of the agreement are?
So the provisions are, some of them are already online. So the EU has publicised or released all of its proposals to us in the free trade agreement negotiations. So you can see the EU's proposals. You can also see online on the MFAT website where New Zealand has made proposals into the free trade agreement negotiations. So where we've proposed a new chapter or something like that's publicly available. What's not available is the draft negotiating texts, so those are held between the EU and New Zealand. But what we do release is a public summary after each negotiating round, so you can actually work out, okay, so these negotiators were meeting and talking about those particular chapters or provisions. So we think we're being open and transparent, but if there are aspects that are not clear, please let us know, because we want to be open and upfront.
I mean, if there are any goods exporters in the room and they are wanting to know what the possible rule of origin might be for their goods, I've got some cards here. You can just see me afterwards and I can give you the card and you can email me direct.
Yep.
So kia ora.
I was going to say
Chris.
Christine Mullender, who's New Zealand's foremost roux and expert.
Sorry, so
We don't want to export you, Chris.
So yeah, so where there's a specific rule or specific product specific rule that might be relevant to your business, Chris is open and available to talk to people about those particular issues. So we think we're being making really positive steps in terms of the transparency of negotiations. But if there are elements that are that you are interested in but are not available, please just get in touch with us. We want to meet with anyone who wants to meet with us, and we don't have a sort of formal submission period that closes and all of a sudden our door is shut. We're open to meet with anyone at any time. So it's not just these quite formal sessions. We're open to meet with people individually as well.
Any other questions from the floor? That concludes our question and answer session. I think it's probably time for everyone to take a break and take the opportunity to come and talk to Ali and John and Christine afterwards about perhaps your individual concerns. Thank you for such an engaging and comprehensive discussion about the EU and trade negotiations generally.